Okay, everybody, so today we're going to be looking at the Atlantic slave trade. Last week we talked about the 7 Years' War and the colonization of North America. That's very important because what happened was when they were colonizing North America, slaves were brought over. So the film we're going to be watching is called Amistad. And before I start telling you a little bit of a history of Amistad, we got to know a little bit of history about the Atlantic slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade is referred to as the triangular trade. There's 3 sides to the Atlantic slave trade, hence a triangle, right? 3 sides, so triangle, you know? Anyways, so side 1. So the side 1, it ultimately begins at the Age of Discovery, which we talked about last class, how the Portuguese and the Spanish empires were moving over to the Americas. So one of the big things were the Portuguese. They were one of the major players in the Atlantic slave trade. So they started moving away from gold because slaves were a more lucrative business. You could make a lot more money by buying and selling slaves. What would also happen is that the Europeans would trade goods to African kings for slaves. So you got to think about why would these African kings sell their own people? Because they knew that if they did not, they may end up being a slave. It's very interesting to see that. Continuing, we look at the second side. So I included a nice map. The map shows how the slaves were transferred from different parts of Africa all over to the Americas. So we can see slaves going to Brazil, slaves going to the Caribbean islands, slaves going to North America. That's important, right? And a lot of the slaves come from more of the eastern, like the coastal parts of Africa. So the third side, this is the most important side, is that when the slaves were sent to the Americas, they did all that work. They would go to plantations, right? And they would harvest goods like cotton, tobacco, sugar, or rum. And these goods would be sent to Europe. For example, let's see, we get rum. You can get in the Caribbean islands. Same idea with like the sugar. Cotton, a lot of times, were in the southern United States. So we're going to look at La Amistad. So the film is going to be about what actually happened upon this ship. So La Amistad was a 19th century boat. It was a schooner, to be exact, and it was owned by the Spanish. So what happened was they already got slaves from Sierra Leone, which is in eastern Africa, and they brought them to Havana, Cuba. Now they put them on the ship, and they were going to transfer them to Puerto Principe. What happened was they found a rusty file, and they're able to free themselves. And once the slaves freed themselves, they were revolting on the ship. They were killing every single person except the captain. The reason why they did not kill the captain was that they needed somebody to steer the ship. They needed somebody to take them back home. So the captain said, yes, don't kill me. I'll send you back home. And the captain lied. He sent them to Long Island, New York. And I put a picture here. This is an example of one of the leaders of the revolt. So what happened was when they were brought to New York, they were arrested. Now, they went on trial because we have to remember something about the United States at this time. In the United States, the northern parts of the U.S., they were not for slavery. They did not accept it. It was not acceptable. In the South, slavery was perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable. So what does this mean? Well, there's conflicting sides. There's a conflicting battle as to what's going to happen. So the verdict, the slaves were acquitted. So that means they were acquitted of their charges. They were allowed to go home. They were allowed to go back to Sierra Leone, actually. And what happened was, you'd have to think now, what's going to happen until these slaves are actually allowed to go home? Well, there's people called abolitionists, and what their job is, they ultimately help slaves who free from their captors to get the Underground Railway, which leads them to free areas like different parts of Canada, and helps them get home. So what they did was, this group of about 50 people, they kept them in a village and kept them safe and away from any possible danger until they're able to get home. So that concludes this little segment on the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to continue more. We're going to look at the economic factors of slavery, why slavery was economically advantageous. We're going to look at the shipping, because that's a huge part of the Atlantic slave trade, is the conditions in which they brought the slaves over. They brought them on boats, which ultimately were very poorly designed and very poorly equipped to carry the slaves over. So we're going to be looking at that tomorrow, and I hope you'll all have a great time. Good night.